Okay, my iPhone says 12:30, so we're going to go with that. Welcome everybody. Glad that we have such a large crowd here to hear our two presenters, or I guess the second session has dual presenters, so our three presenters. I'm Marshall George. I'm a professor at Hunter College, part of the City University of New York in New York City. So I guess it makes sense or not that I'm introducing a session on Make Space for Me, Identity and Teaching Rural Waya Handout Literature. I grew up rural, so I guess maybe that's why. So anyway, I'm going to let the presenters introduce themselves as they start. You have 20 minutes, and there are a lot of people in here, so I'll try to wave my arms or something when you're getting close, or but we're going to hold pretty tight to the 20-minute mark. And then if people will just hold questions to the end, or if you post questions in the chat, I'll try to collect them and try to facilitate the Q&A at the end. All right. So Shay, going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Marshall. And I had no idea that you grew up rural. Learn something new every day.
North Carolina.
That's really interesting. I'm excited that you are on this panel then, chairing it, or however we term it. But hi y'all, I am Shay Parton, and I am going to present on the use of rural young adult literature in secondary ELA classrooms. I'm currently at the University of Texas at Austin, and if after this presentation you want to know more, feel free to contact me at that email address. I did drop my slides in the chat, so hopefully you will have continued access to them and can reference them in the future if you'd like. Okay, so to sort of contextualize this work, really to understand me and to understand my work, you need to know that this is where I'm from. This is the north-facing field of my family's like 120 acres, and it is where I grew up. Currently there are wheat and beans in there, and so that's kind of get a picture in your head that this is where I'm from, and it's a huge part of why I'm doing this work. Here are some other, this is the barn on my grandparents' part of the farm. And that was kind of in winter. This is in summer, and this is kind of, this is just the scenery that I grew up around. And so this is our farm. This is where my grandparents lived. This is my mom and stepdad's house where I grew up. And then this is where I live now. And moving here, I felt a lot of emotions, and
you had it upstairs, and I said
a lot of claustrophobia.
Plug it in,
and so that got me to thinking about, what does it mean to be from a place? What does it mean to be rural? And what does that look like? So I thought we could start out with like a little 5-minute quick write. If you just want to take a few minutes to think about like where you're from, what are the pictures and images that come up for you when you think about where you're from? What kind of cultural and regional language and or cultural practices do you think are connected to that place? How far from you, and obviously you don't have to answer all these questions, but these I just thought were some things that I continue to think about. How far are you from that home place? And how do you think that all of this has affected who you are as a reader, a writer, a teacher, a person? So I'm gonna start a timer for 5 minutes or so, and we can just sort of write to be in the same place, no pun intended, together. Maybe 5 minutes is too long. Let's do 2 minutes. I'm worried I won't get through everything. Okay. So hopefully that has kind of, you've had a chance to sort of think about like where you're from and how that has impacted you as a person and how that personal identity has impacted you as a teacher. And that's essentially what I was looking at in this study. And I wanted to look at that, how place impacts the personal and professional identity development of teachers, because there are very few, if any, universities or colleges located in rural areas. So the people who live in those places who want to go to college have to leave those places in order to do that. And then whether or not they return, has a lot to do with a lot of different factors. But many of them decide to settle in more suburban or urban places. And some of that has to do with the representation of rural people in places as overwhelmingly deficit laden. So if you think about popular culture and the Beverly Hillbillies and Swamp People and Deliverance and Duck Dynasty and all of these representations of who rural people are in the deficit, identifying as rural and letting anybody know that that's how you identify is somewhat of a tricky endeavor. So you may be thinking, well, how did you define rural? Well, thinking about place as more than geography and instead thinking about it as the complex interactions between people and culture and language, rather than define rural the way the US Census Bureau defines it, because essentially they define it as the not urban, I instead relied on Mara Tikin's work, which says the rural is that which identifies itself as rural. And so I allowed my teachers to self-identify as rural, and then they could let me know like what that looked like in terms of the geography and the interaction between it, because I grew up in a town of 800, which to me is super rural, but there are much more remote and rural places than that. So, how we define what that looks like is kind of tricky. And then I also thought about identity construction and looked at that as extremely connected to language, and sort of thought of identity as the stories that we tell about ourselves as we become those stories. So the question that I'm going to address in this presentation is how does the place connectedness of rural outmigrant teachers shape who they are as people, as professionals in their teaching practice? Sorry if I'm going through this really fast, but I'm afraid that I'm gonna run out of time. So basically I interviewed 7 rural outmigrant teachers with various intersectional identities from different ruralities around the country. I collected the interviews. I also looked at artifacts, and I did multiple readings of the transcripts. We did some co-analysis together to make sure that we were on the same page. And then I wrote up individual cases and looked across those cases to think about how they were restoring their identities now that they are sort of in this in-between space, because they're no longer rural, but they once had been, and they didn't start out suburban or urban, and that's kind of where they were now. So one of the major things that I found was that outmigrant teachers restore their identities by taking up, rejecting, and reconfiguring or blending characteristics commonly attributed to rural and sub or sub/urban suburban places and people by dominant cultural narratives. And so the way that they restored those personal identities were inextricably connected to the way that they taught in their classrooms. So some examples of that. One of my participants, Finley, all of these are pseudonyms, took up a small town girl. She identified as a small town girl. So she took that part up, but she rejected what she viewed as the conservative, the political conservatism and the racism that was sort of embedded in the bedrock of her community where she grew up. And she really valued the landscape. And so when she was working on finding a place in the suburbs to live, she chose a place that was across the street from like a 100-acre park, so that she could be near the kind of natural landscape that she wanted to be. Jacqueline also took up the community center beliefs and values of her rural community. She identified as a Black woman from coastal South Carolina, and so the construction of her rural community was a lot different than what we typically think of rural communities. She rejected ideas around waste and dealing with trauma that she felt like were sort of connected to her community, and she also really appreciated the landscape. She had hickory nuts and pine cones all over her house, and those are not things that are readily found in Texas. And so she really wanted the landscape around her. In a similar way, Riley also took up connections to landscape. She also rejected the political conservatism that she felt like was deeply connected to her rural place. And she also worked to sort of reject her rural language variety, but actually ended up blending it because she felt like at times of stress, she couldn't always police her language in the way that she wanted to. So the way that this sort of came to connect to their, one of the ways, their instruction is whether or not they chose to or even thought about putting rural YA texts in their classroom libraries. All of these teachers were teachers who taught reading workshop style and had really extensive classroom libraries. But when I asked them, well, what kind of rural books do you have? There was always like a pause and like wide eyes and like an searching, and they couldn't really think of any. And then once they started to think of some, many of them were really dated, or could be, you know, The Impossible Knife of Memory. Folks could argue that that's not really a rural book. So there was a lot of interesting thinking around and practices regarding the kind of text that teachers were teaching, even though they were at schools where they were sort of at urban schools where like rural and urban communities came together in one building. And so even though they still served rural families and students, none of these teachers had very many rural books in their libraries at all, even though they were all striving to be culturally sustaining teachers. So a lot of that was connected to their identities. So Riley said to me, because I grew up pushing away from my rural conservative values, I was the one looking for other texts, sci-fi, books that represented something different, right? The other. I tried to get out of it, she said. So rural stories weren't something that she gravitated toward. Similarly for Finley, I almost feel like because I pushed back so much that I have never recommended, and I don't know if I've ever read, like I'm even trying to think of a rural novel, no. So even though they have identities that they still sort of connect to their rural places, they weren't really connecting to or looking for rural books in their own reading lives or for their students in classroom libraries. Jacqueline talked about how happy she was to see a children's book called Gabe and His Green Thumb published, because there aren't very many books about people of color in rural spaces doing things that the people of color who live in rural spaces do. So because she has grandchildren, she was so excited that this children's book was showing them a piece of their identity that was largely missing from the other, you know, children's literature that they had been reading and were exposed to. And Jacqueline pointed out, and this is kind of where the title for this presentation comes from, you know, if we're going to be the kind of people who are moving toward culturally sustaining practices, then we got to see that there's more than just whatever the dominant narrative is, which is urban and suburban. Like when we think about it, rural's not even thought much of, even though this country is rural, it's not the dominant narrative. It's not even a narrative. It's a narrative often left out of conversations. And so she talked about how whenever identity markers come up that feel missing, like we have to make space for them. And she feels like rural is one of those. So I thought we could pause for reflection a little bit and think about how, oh, I have 2 minutes. I have 2 minutes. Like, can Marshall, how am I doing on time?
No, you have until 12:51. So you've got
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
7 minutes.
Okay, great. So let's take just a couple minutes to sort of reflect on our own practices, whether we're teachers or teacher educators. Like, you know, what contemporary young adult or middle grade titles have you read that feature rural settings and or people? Were the characters more complex than the sort of stereotypes that exist of rural folks? Do you have any rural YA or middle grades fiction in your classroom libraries or on your syllabus? Do you actively work to include rural stories in your classroom? And if you do, why do you do that work? And if not, you know, think about why not. So just a couple minutes to think about that, and then I'll move on to conclude my presentation. there's a lot of people recommending stuff in the chat, and that's great. And I'm gonna also share some things that might be helpful to you at the end of this. So hopefully you've had some time to think. It looks like a lot of people are doing some reflection around what they use, why they use it, and if they don't, that maybe they should. So some possibilities for practice. One of the first things that we need to do is situate rural YA as worthy of teaching, reading, and studying. A lot of the teachers, like I talked about, thought that, you know, rural YA, first of all, they may not have thought about it. And when I started asking them about it, they assumed that rural YA was just going to reify or, you know, reinscribe or perpetuate somehow the values that they were pushing away from, and the reason why they chose not to go back to their rural communities. And so situating rural YA and studying it in a critical way is super important. If you haven't picked up Rob Patron and Allison Weinop Olson's Teaching English in Rural Communities, it's super, super good, and also gives a lot of ideas for teaching from a critical rural perspective. I'll get to this in a second, but we can also teach rural YA in ways that work to sustain rural cultures. A lot of culturally sustaining work has to do and is situated within, you know, metropolitan centers. It's very metrocentric. And so a lot of the teachers, even though they thought that they were being culturally sustaining in their practice, weren't really, because they were teaching rural students without providing them access to texts that reflect their rural realities, and they weren't providing windows to their non-rural students to think more about rurality from a critical perspective. So these are some ideas. What I wanted to share with you today is something that I've been working on for a little while, and I have started a website. It's called Dr. Partons Literacy in Place. I wanted to keep it kind of broad, but right now it has a rural focus. One of the most important things I think that is on this site is that I'm doing some YouTube series where I review and discuss the representation of rurality in different young adult literature books. I have this connected to my rural reads, or my Reading Rural Goodreads page, where I'm gonna do sort of a different approach to reviewing text there. And then I have also created, and I'm going to steal all of your amazing, thank you so much, Michelle, for dropping that in the chat. I'm going to start stealing these suggestions that y'all are putting in the chat and put them on my list. So what I've done is I've kind of curated them, and I realized that when you start to pull things, you know, tease things apart and try to categorize them, that it's never perfect, but I tried to pick out identity markers that I thought would be really important to folks. Nora Shalway Carpenter's Rural Voices is one of those that's really hard to categorize because there are so many amazingly nuanced representations of rurality in that anthology. So if you haven't read that, definitely check it out. But so each of these has, you know, if you just, it jumps to the list, and then you can go back to the top, and some of them are really short, some of them are a little longer than others, but I'm working on updating those, and I'll be updating those regularly. If you're a teacher educator and you want to think about texts to teach or lessons and activities that you can do in your methods classroom, I also have a suggested reading list of, hopefully it's going to turn into an annotated bibliography at some point, but it's downloadable and it's here for you if you want to find resources for your methods classes. And there are ideas, you know, there's always the problem of coverage, right? Like how many things can we squeeze into the syllabus? And so I tried to show how the things that folks are already doing in their methods classes can be situated in a way that allows people to think about place. So there's a lot of stuff here, and I hope that you check it out. I do have, if you are in the PowerPoint, I have a Google form. Will this link work if I put it in there? If you could fill this out if you're interested in knowing more, or if you have suggestions of text that I should add, or if you have other ideas for collaborating, I would love to, thank you, Michelle. I would love to learn more about you and the work that you're doing, and partner with you in whatever way makes the most sense. But so that is my presentation. I know it was probably pretty rapid fire, but I thank you all for being here, and I hope to hear from you soon.
That's probably the most perfect timing I've ever seen, Shay. you hit it right on the time that was your stop time. So congratulations for that. All right, so without ado, we'll switch over to our second presentation with Rebecca Weber and Sarah Donovan from Oklahoma State University. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. Hi, how's our volume? Good? Okay, awesome. All right, so welcome to, we're doing another research presentation. So there's not a lot of activities here, but we're excited to share with you what we have been thinking about related to working with pre-service teachers, reading young adult and literature featuring disabilities. And before we begin, I want to do a land acknowledgement. We're presenting today from Willard Hall, which is on the campus of Oklahoma State University. Our school acknowledges and honors the Kickapoo, Chea, Osage, Pawnee, Quapaw, and other indigenous peoples whose ancestral lands we occupied, and we hope we honor them with our work today.
So, hi, I'm Rebecca Weber. I am an associate professor and librarian at Oklahoma State. I manage the Education and Teaching Library at my university, which houses a lot of children's and young adult literature, and I have cerebral palsy. And so this picture of me is when I first got my crutches in 2013, and they have been a huge help to me. And so that is one way that I come to this discussion.
And my name is Sarah Donovan, and I actually am from Chicago, and I've been a middle school teacher for 20 years, and I'm a new assistant professor at Oklahoma State University. And the first place that I came when I arrived here was the library, so I can get to know Rebecca and get to know the wonderful education library that she curates. I also come here because I am non-disabled, but my first few years of my marriage, I was the primary caregiver for my mother-in-law who had ALS, and she has since passed, so I'm sorry to say that, but I come here thinking about my life and my experiences navigating her world, and so we come together to have this conversation about the way that our program and the way that we're serving our pre-service teachers is making space for those stories.
So we had these 3 questions that drove our research. We wanted to know about pre-service teachers' personal reading practices and how their coursework featured or didn't feature young adult literature with characters with disabilities. We wanted to see what kinds of lenses they used when they were reading young adult literature featuring characters with disabilities, and kind of from what experiences or disciplines they might draw when they were trying to bridge this topic of discussion in their classrooms.
And so we come with this, we really came to this to think about ways that we can improve the English education program here, and me being new faculty. We just began with our conversation and thinking about books, and those were the questions that we wanted to answer. And we just wanted to get a sense of what was kind of going on in our state. And so we began with doing some literature review, and we looked at disability studies in English education. And I'll just kind of read a little bit of the literature that we looked at. So Booth defined disability in a social way, using a social model as a barrier to participation for people with impairments or chronic illnesses that arise from an interaction of the impairment or illness with discriminatory attitudes, cultures, policies, institutional practices. And then we also looking at spaces. So we're focusing on visible disabilities. And then, of course, our work is really informed by the work of Patricia Dunn, who wrote Disabling Characters, Representations of Disability in Young Adult Literature in 2014. And this book is a guiding light. And so thank you so much for your work. And so the key here is that so many of the novels do not focus on disability or even mention it as part of the life for so many people. So it's critical that the few texts that we do read with our students and the rare discussions that do take place, that they do more than support status quo regarding society's very limiting view of disability. And so we wanted to know what kind of stories and the way students were talking about them. And then this project was funded by the Allen Foundation grant, so we were able to purchase books. And so we are very thankful for them. And our methodology was that we used semi-structured interviews with 12 pre-service teachers. We did all the interviews via Zoom last summer, and we asked about their college experiences and exposures to the concept of disability in literature and curriculum and in their lives. Before the interview, we mailed the interviewees 1 or 2 books of their own choosing from a long list that we didn't curate. We were just but Rebecca's going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then we coded the interviews using Craig Hill's 5 perspectives frameworks that you can find on Dr. Rick Moore's Waya Wednesday page, and we'll talk a little bit more about using that framework.
So these are some of the books that we chose. The one on the end here is Your Welcome Universe. It's a Snyder Family Book Award winner. The Snyder Family Book Award is from the American Library Association, and it kind of highlights the disability experience, and those are some really great books. So if you want to look at a list of some good books for disability representation, both physical and mental, then that's a good place to start. We did not, as Sarah mentioned, curate the books that we suggested to our students. We just looked at the last 5 years of publication, and anything that had featured a main character with a visible disability, we put on the list, because we wanted to see how our pre-service teachers would react to those, and if they would sort of have some kind of filter or ability to evaluate those titles. And we found a lot of them didn't do that pre-searching for those books or looking at anything. They chose some different things by genre and other things that we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, so as Rebecca was saying, like part of the framework that we're going to talk about in just a second was really important, because we wanted to know what lens or what kind of perspective that our pre-service teachers were using when they chose books for themselves or for their classroom. So that was really important.
So these are some of the rest of the books that our students selected. Our Chemical Hearts and Taxonomy of Love are both pretty popular and more recent publications there.
All right. Okay, so I'll just talk a little bit about our teacher participants. So we had 12 participants. I think there maybe was a total of 15, and then 12 actually like
three of them sort of ghosted us.
Yeah.
At some point in
That's
the process.
Okay. They're allowed to. They're allowed to. So these were, we actually just reached out to other English ed programs in our state and shared this call, and so many teachers were so excited to get free books. So they were going to, because everyone was going to get 2 free books, and they just had to read them. So they selected from these books, we sent it to them, and then asked them just to read it, no homework or anything like that, just read it. And then we did interviews with them. And so you can just kind of see most were in their 3rd or 4th year of their teacher ed program. We asked about the courses that they had related to any disability, or any conversations that they had where there was discussions of disability. And then the books that they selected and read. And so many selected 2 but only read 1, and there's lots of reasons for that too. But you can sort of see most had a special education course by the time they were in their 3rd or 4th year. A few had young adult literature courses, but very few actually had read any young adult literature or middle grade literature featuring a character with a physical disability or visible disability. Several had a critical issues course or a multicultural literature course, and so there was some kind of experience having conversations with a critical lens. So we were really kind of looking to see whether or not and how these kinds of topics would come up when we did our interview. And then here's the interview framework using Craig Hill's 5-perspective framework. And so he talks about in his article that when he's training or working with his pre-service teachers, he asks them to sort of navigate these 5 different perspectives. And I think it's pretty fair that we do this in our courses. And I really am stuck on doing this also now. Everything I read, I'm always kind of navigating all of these different perspectives. So as a reader, what do I prefer to read? What do I enjoy? How do I use that lens when I'm choosing books? As a character, how does the main character's context inform their experience? Can I step into that perspective when I read? As a teacher, of course, so many of my decisions, and I'm sure Rebecca as a librarian, so maybe we should add as a librarian in here too. How does the book fit with high school curriculum? How would we share it with students? As a writer, thinking about the decisions that the author made, and then as a literary critic, like thinking about all the English education courses that our students take in our programs, like what coursework or theories are relevant when they're reading? What do they draw on when they're reading? And so we were curious to hear about this because we were not their professors. We're just interested in hearing about their program. So it's outside of the program.
So as we started to get the interviews back and begin coding, we came up with the 3 themes that you see here. And mostly the reasons for reading were a lot based on their personal experiences. Sometimes if they were in their student teaching semester, they were imagining their future classrooms, or some of them chose based on the character, the disability that was portrayed there. They wanted to expand their knowledge on that. And so then the character and settings interactions, we saw our students pointed out some discrimination for the characters with disabilities, or one character trying to fix another character or make something easier for them. And then often in the YA literature, we saw non-inclusive schools and teachers, and that's probably because YA centers around the teen experience in some ways. And so framing disability and unit planning, a lot of our students were still stuck on overcoming or like presenting disability as something to be overcome. And they wanted to provide books for students who didn't have disabilities as empathy tools. And I think they had a hard time imagining that they would have students with disabilities in their classrooms. And then of course, coming of age is still a theme, as we see in a lot of YA Lit. And then the disability is a theme. There are stories, books and novels coming out more now that are pushing past just the disability story, where the character will have a disability, but it's not the center of the plot, that I think is more real life and realistic than what we were seeing even a couple of years ago. And then disrupting the disability stigma, like, oh, this person can do these other things that kids that were without disabilities can do. It's something that came up a lot. So, yeah. So we had findings. We found our students were able to discuss the books themselves, but if they liked a book, they weren't sure always how to translate that into the classroom or how it might work for them. So only one of our participants discussed having a disability. If others did, they didn't mention it in their interviews. But we had a few that had worked with students with disabilities, either as part of their special education training in their program, or maybe as a volunteer experience. Most of them said they wouldn't have considered or thought about the character's disability as much if they hadn't been thinking about it in terms of our study. That kind of surprised me, because as a person with a disability, like I'm really critical and careful about the characters that I see. And so it's a bigger deal for me. And I was surprised to see that they didn't care as much as I thought they would.
Yeah. All right, so we are going to share this handout with you. And then Rebecca and I are just going to have a little conversation. And by the way, the study will be out in the next issue of English Education, so you can read it in more depth. So I'm going to put this in here. Okay, so we have on this handout, there are some terms and some of our findings kind of illuminated regarding models and approaches to thinking about disability, and also some implications. And then there is a second page with a list of books. So I want to make sure that that's shared with everybody. Can someone give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen with the books? Okay, great. So here's kind of the key takeaway for me, in part because I'm reimagining and trying to think about the English education program here at Oklahoma State. And the key for me is that most of the students were only talking or thinking about disability representation or thinking about social, the social model of disability in their special education course. So it wasn't integrated, it wasn't brought across the courses. It was just, so they came at it really with this IEP 504 medical model lens. And for me, that seemed very narrow-sighted. And so our participants were having a hard time making that transition from what they knew about critical literacy and having a critical lens when they're reading their English courses, coursework, and literature, and bringing that to literature representing disability. So this is that disability studies lens that Dr. Dunn has really developed so well in her disabling characters. And I just think like this book and her articles need to be embedded across the courses of English education. So that's a key finding for me, and looking and auditing the syllabi in all of our courses, and then also talking to the English department. So here are some books for the education coursework that I'm integrating, some stories, chapters, poetry, and then for the young adult literature, these are books that we're also embedding in our Waya literature course, but also the other courses, even just the methods courses or the writing course, and just bringing it in so we're not just doing a unit on disability, but the representation is integrated throughout. So I really would love to hear Rebecca talk a little bit about her findings or her takeaway from our study.
So for me, the big thing as a librarian has been the idea of just broadening the collection. Even though as a person with a disability, I'm more aware, I've realized that we do not have as many books featuring characters with disabilities as we should. And so I'm on a mission to add all kinds of experiences and representations to our collection. And I want to be able to speak up when I see representations that could be better as we're choosing books, and as I hear from faculty what books are going into certain courses, I want to make sure that those are good representation. So that's two ways that we're working through things, and then just making sure that the library is supporting this overarching goal to try to be more inclusive of disability, because often even in discussions of diversity, disability gets left out of those. So we want to make sure that we're giving as much effort to that as we are to other types of diversity on campus.
And I'll just say one last thing is we're hoping for more intersectional representation. I think the Disability Visibility is a fantastic collection of essays I think would be great in an AP literature course. And the new young adult version of young adult of Disability Visibility, I haven't seen it yet, but I think it's going to be amazing and really important to kind of embed in our courses too. And we're just continuing to just kind of keep questioning representation, and also looking at it with the great work that Dr. Dunn has done with disability studies for English education. All right, thanks everybody.
I don't think I've ever chaired a session where both presenters were exactly on the moment, and I wouldn't have to wave my hands in the background or anything. So thank you. So let's open it up now for questions. You can either type them in the chat. The chat's going wild with lots of praise and ideas of books, whatnot. But do people have any questions for either of our presenters? And you can just unmute yourself and ask it.
I had a question. Thank you for this. That was really excellent. It's so true that students have kind of a mixed feeling about like the overcoming myth, you know, like they think that that's a good thing. And of course, disability studies, it isn't seen as a good thing, it's seen as othering. And I found the same thing with my students regarding like, quote unquote, inspiring stories. Oh, it was so inspiring, so inspiring. And I mean, these are sincere, great people. And so, you know, I have to like gently tell them that that's othering too, to see people as inspiring and not just as themselves. So I guess my question is, how do you broach this sort of unlearning with very well-meaning students who want to do the right thing, but they're just so a part of the cultural assumptions? Like how do you broach that with your students?
So for me, I broached it with faculty as well.
Can you tell a little bit the story? No, maybe not. Okay, go ahead.
Which one?
Well, some faculty came with like a list of picture books and was like asking for Rebecca's perspective. And
there's one that we're still discussing because her disability sort of disappears. It becomes there's a fantasy sequence where she becomes non-disabled, and then people's perceptions of her change, and that really bothers me. So we're discussing. But I have used, there's a TED Talk, and now the presenter's name is going to go out of my head. And she was a teacher in Australia. And Stella Young. And Stella, her TED Talk about why inspirational stories are more like disability porn and why that's objectifying. That helped me be able to have a conversation with faculty when they say that I'm inspiring, because I just got tenure. I'm, you know, a librarian and I work full time and I have a disability. So they're like, isn't that hard for you? And I don't, maybe sometimes it is, but like, I don't just want to be that inspiration. I want to be normal and seen as like every other faculty member is seen. So I've had that discussion, and I think you just have to, like, I've shown that TED Talk or told people about it, and that helps to have somebody else say it too. Because if you say I'm not inspirational, and then they think you're being like modest, you know. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. It's hard.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm just looking at it.
Other questions or comments? I do encourage folks at the end to save the chat, download it into your Zoom, because there's a lot of good stuff in there, and so that's always a good thing at the end. When I saw the two titles of these sessions, I was thinking, you know, so what's the connection? You know, how are these two paired together? And I'm not sure how Steve did that, but as I'm listening to you, I really am thinking about, you know, Patty used the word, you know, the idea of othering, and you know, at least in my context of being in New York City, you know, the idea of rural just seems so you know, even though you can go, you know, 30 miles away and you're rural, but a lot of our students don't necessarily think that way. But I really do think that these actually speak to each other and kind of the way, both the types of studies you did, but then also just kind of the content and context are surprisingly closer than I thought they were going to be.
Yeah, I think, oh, Shay, go ahead, Shay.
I was just gonna say, I'm really glad that we were in the same session together because y'all have me thinking about rural, especially like the girl in red, because there's a lot about rurality and sort of the connection between rurality, that overlap and that intersection between rurality and disability. That is so missing from my site. It's so missing from the lists that I've been making, and I would love to connect with y'all and think about books that would be good to add and to help teachers find, you know, because it's so hard to find rural books at all. But
there's actually one about a little girl with CP that just came out, and again, the title is now out of my head, but I'll find it and send it to you.
I would love that, and so appreciate it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me and for all of us who are working with teachers and have any sort of control over our syllabi and our teacher program, I think it's just helpful to think across every book that they're reading, you know, every course that they have, you know, are we looking at representation across all the identity intersections? And, you know, we can't do everything, we can't teach everything. But I think that there is a critical lens that we can just keep coming to and just making sure that there's space for so many different ways of being. And I think that's what Shay's work has helped me really think about and reflect on. And certainly why I think collaboration is so important in our field is to have someone to have conversations with.
They've built in a 10-minute stretch break between sessions. It looks like you're going to get 12. So thank you all for the presentations. Thank you to our host and to all everybody in the audience. Have a good rest of your conference, our conference.
Thank you, Marshall George.
Bye.
And thanks for that speed dating activity a long time ago where I met Dr. Bickmore.
Oh my gosh, that thing is famous.
Yeah. All right, we're out.